Episode 36, here we go. Might as well call this the catch-up episode. It has been, well, it was 6 weeks when I reached out for the questions. It's now been 7 weeks since I have answered anything Q&A style. Skipped last week. Sometimes you have the best of intentions and then life gets in the way a little bit, but I'm trying to make up for it. I have a ton of questions sitting here in front of me, and we're going to get into them here really shortly. A little bit of an addition to the podcast today. For the first time, I have a co-host. My daughter, who is 9, wanted to be involved, and so what I did is I had her read me a couple of these questions, I think even maybe about half of them, and hopefully it'll break up the monotony of hearing just my voice, because even I hate hearing just my voice. But before we get into it, this episode is brought to you by Onnit, like my last 4 episodes were. Onnit.com, ONNIT.com/hot, the exact opposite of cold. If you can't remember that, to be honest with you, I don't know what to do. I don't think I'm going to be able to help you, nor is anything on the Onnit site going to be able to help you. So they're a supplement company. Right now, they're still running their Alpha Brain trial. If you go to Onnit.com/hot, you're going to land on the Alpha Brain trial page. If you click on it, you're going to get a bottle with 14. It's for memory. It's for focus. Actually, last week, I used it quite a bit to kind of pull me out of the cellar mentally a little bit. I was having a hard time sleeping. Still kind of am having a hard time sleeping. And when I don't get, I wouldn't even necessarily call it good sleep. When I don't get sleep really of any kind, when I'm tossing and turning between the ears, I kind of just feel like there's cobwebs. So a cup of coffee in the morning and wash down a dosage of Alpha Brain, 2 pills. And it makes a difference for me for sure. And if you want to try it, risk-free, worry-free, go to Onnit.com/hot, sign up for it. But what I will say is this, you're probably going to have to put in your credit card number. And at some point, if you don't cancel the free trial, you may end up getting charged. I haven't been. I have signed up for those in the past and have not canceled. And it sucks because you end up fighting for it. You can't get your money back sometime, which has nothing to do with the trial that's going on with Onnit right now. The point is, if you sign up for it, just make sure that you cancel it if you don't like it, or order a bigger bottle than 14 if you do. And that's about it. If you don't want to do the Alpha Brain trial, in the upper left-hand corner, there's a little button you click, it says Onnit. It'll take you to the Onnit homepage, and it's got everything from supplements, bars, the protein bars, protein bites. Those things are amazing. A variety of supplements there, everything from their daily packs, nighttime, daytime daily pack stuff, which I take every day, to some stuff that I haven't tried, gut health, fill in the blank. Go in there, have a good time, have a blast. And if you go through the website, you get 10% off. And that's it. So, shall we get into it? Let's get into it. Here we go. Episode 36, Q&A, the catch-up episode, coming at you.
Okay, got the red smoke.
Gun run, north or south, west of the smoke, west of the smoke.
Okay, copy, west of the smoke. I'm looking at danger close now.
Come on with it, baby, give it to me, I need it. You're cleared hot.
Copy, cleared hot.
How are you liking the Maven optics, and what model are you using?
This could be the easiest question of the evening. I am absolutely loving the optics that Maven sent me. They specifically sent me the B1s and the B2s, which are going to give you different types of magnification. I'm actually holding both of them in my hand right now. So the B2 is an 11 by 45. The B1 is a 10 by 42. And they also sent me a spotting scope. I think it's the S1A or the SA1. And like I said, I love them. They're the same size as other binos. Actually, first, before I get into that, if you're looking for a set of binos, you're not going to be able to find these in any store. They are a direct-to-consumer model, which saves them paying the margin for the retailer. And if you're unsure about how you want to deal, or if you're unsure about making purchases on the internet, which I personally am, they have a demo program as well, so you can actually get them in your hand. I've hunted twice with these now, once hogs in Oklahoma, and just recently in Lanai hunting axis deer. The axis deer was much harder, or the axis deer hunt, not the deer themselves, was much harder on the optic because of the terrain that we were in and the fact that I was crawling on my face for miles, what seemed like never-ending miles at a time. And the mud there, or the clay, or the dust, it's basically created by Satan to destroy everything. It's a fine red powder that I'm still pulling out of my ears with Q-tips, and you can imagine what that does to anything that has a wheel or a knob or it's movable. And they stood up to him great. Normal power like normal as in I've seen a lot of people using these 10 by 42 or seem to be your kind of day-to-day lightweight. They go around your neck, very easy. If you want to bump it up a little bit, like I said, I have the where are these? The B2s, hashtag cleared hot version. It's no big deal. Don't get that. Damn it, that's mine. And 11 by 45. So I love them. They're bomb-proof so far. And if you're looking at getting a good pair of binos, I would start right there.
What is the hardest part of being a military dad?
Hardest part about being a military dad. I don't know if you need to add the military portion to that, even though I think there are unique challenges that come with and from being in the military. But I think there's just challenges in general to being a father. Specifically, though, if you're going to talk about the military and the challenges that come with that, I would say the biggest challenge is actually just being there. And I mean that in two ways. Physically, can be challenging in its own right to actually be there when your child needs you or wants you, which is hopefully all the time. But you're going to lose control of your schedule to a large degree, especially if you're on a deployment cycle and you're going to have large chunks of time out of town. Holidays, birthdays, special occasions. It doesn't mean that they mean any less to you, but the reality is you are going to miss more of those than you would ever want to. And with that, what I have found in the strongest military families that I have seen is that the family itself develops a sense of independence outside of the military member. And that can be pretty difficult to deal with. You want to be an integral part of the family. You want them, not that you want them hanging on or waiting on you as an individual, but you want to be important in their life. And you have to accept the fact that their world is going to keep spinning even when you aren't there. And my advice would be, you need to let it and almost even help develop that sense of independence, not trying to get them to grow away from you, but even in your kids, and especially I would say in your spouse, help create that sense where it's okay that if they can make decisions without you, if they can handle things when you're not going to be there, because there are going to be times where you're just not going to be. So help that process, don't hinder it. So that's the first part. Being physically there is very challenging. And then for me, I would say this second part is probably was more of my challenge, and that was the mental aspect of being there. And I am guilty of physically being there, but mentally being somewhere else. And I found it most of the time when I had a deployment pending or had just come off of a deployment. And the reality is that you might think that you're pulling off, and you're not. And you're going to regret it in the end. My kids, I would say kids in general, not just my kids, they see more and they hear more than we ever think that they could possibly see or hear. And my kids, and especially my wife, knew when I was physically there, but emotionally or mentally just checked out. It's something that I wish that I had done a much better job of working on. And if you're listening to this and you find yourself in that cycle, especially if the time windows are short and you don't have a long period of time to decompress before your next deployment, find a way to detach yourself from work and reattach yourself to your family. And maybe it's a routine that you go through when it's your drive away from the office until you get to the driveway at home, and just shed and strip away all of the BS that's happening at work and just check back in with your family. With that, you might be at the top of the food chain when you're at work. Everybody at work might have to call you sir. They might have to salute you, whatever it may be. Your kids don't care. When you go home, just be dad. They're not soldiers, and don't expect them to be. And this is another one that I definitely struggle with. Today, as recently as today, I have great value in things like discipline. And to me, they helped me be very successful at my job, and sometimes they can even keep you alive. Putting the dishes in the goddamn dishwasher is an act of discipline. I have a different level and understanding of discipline than my children do, and I'm trying to impart that into them. And if I snap on them by not putting their dishes in the dishwasher and maybe putting the dishes on the edge of the sink next to the dishwasher, I'm not reinforcing the discipline that I want to. What I'm doing is I'm just acting like an asshole. And I'm treating them and expecting from them the discipline that I would expect at all times from the people that I used to work with in the military. So just understand that people who aren't in the military, your spouse is included in this, and your kids, they're not soldiers. Don't expect them to be. With this question, there was another one that dovetailed into it a little bit, and it was advice on relationships and family life when you're in the service. One of them I already covered. Try to create a separation from work and home. Do everything you can not to let it creep into your life. Or what's going to end up happening is you will be wildly successful in your work life, and you're going to really struggle in your personal life. If looking back now out of being out of the military, I will have more impact in this world by being successful in my personal life and being a member of a productive family than I ever had the opportunity to do so with a rifle in my hand on a battlefield. Maximize your physical presence. Take every opportunity that you possibly can. Nobody knows what the future is going to hold in the world, and if the demands of the military change, the dynamic of your lifestyle and your deployment cycle can change rapidly. So don't plan on the future. Try to make as much as you possibly can of the present. And with that, be present in the present. Don't give yourself any excuse to mentally not be there. Let's say the deployment cycle does increase. Take advantage of the advances in communication. I didn't have this until the very tail end of my career, and I can only imagine it continued to get better and has continued to get better as technology has evolved. But stay as connected as possible, without creating a negative impact at work or in your family's life. I would not recommend creating a rigid and, I don't want to say frequent. What I don't want to say is overly frequent. You need to find a balance and a window where you can call if things allow for it. And then if it doesn't, that's going to be okay. If you tell your family you're going to call Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, every day at 7 p.m., and then all of a sudden you miss 2 or 3 of those, what that's going to do is going to create stress on both sides. Communication is great, but you need to be able to focus on your job as well. And you also need to be able to allow a little bit of space. So if your family doesn't hear from you for a couple of days, it's not, the initial reaction isn't panic. Let the environment dictate that for you. Don't try to figure that out before you go on deployment. Maybe take the first 2 or 3 weeks to figure out what the routine is going to be and let that environment dictate it for you. And then the last thing I'll say on this when it comes to relationship and family life advice, which, by the way, I'm wholly unqualified to give in any way, shape, or form. Tell your spouse how much you appreciate them all the time, as often as possible. And that's it. I'll leave it at that.
What is your biggest failure in life? What did you learn from it?
This question made me sit back and think for quite a bit. And when I first started thinking about it, right or wrong, what I started thinking about was individual events. And I rapidly came to the conclusion that I have likely made more mistakes than most people, both personally and professionally. But when I think about them, they all fall into the same category. And that is a moment in my life where I chose pride or selfishness over principles or morals. And it would be very easy to go through individual examples of those, but I'm not going to do that. I'd rather talk about it at a broad level. I have no problem sharing my inadequacies and failures, but I think there's more to be gained and benefit from talking about it at the broad level. So every time that I've done that I've made a decision that I regret, it has been because of, again, choosing pride or my personal selfishness over a principle or a moral that I fully know and understand that I am choosing to ignore. And every time that's happened, I've hurt other people. And I've also hurt myself. And I end up regretting the decisions and actions from my past, which ties into probably, I don't know if I'll call this a failure, but this is something I struggle with. I struggle with forgiveness of other people, but more than anything of myself. And my past weighs on me, some days more than others, but it's something that I struggle with. And by being unable to or struggling with forgiving myself, I found that I have missed out on things that I wish I hadn't missed out on. I've wasted time and energy on the wrong thing, which is anger at either myself or somebody else. And if I could have just forgiven or taken a lesson from it and moved on, I could have dropped that anchor and done something productive. So that's my biggest failure, I would say, as just a man in general. As far as what I learned from those failures, anybody who supports the podcast and bought one of the first shirts that I created, so it said "Cleared Hot" on the front, and it says "Be the Example" on the back, which, by the way, I'm getting ready to do a version 2 of that because I want to change the design a little bit. That's neither here nor there. The point is that phrase doesn't come from thin air. It doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from my own personal failures. I learned that being an example of good morals and integrity are more powerful than the mistakes. And I also learned that I can use the failures from my past to drive action and success in my future. And it also creates a mindset that helps you avoid those mistakes in the future as well. That is where that shirt and that saying comes from. And it's been powerful in my life. I have had quite a few people reach out and say it has done the exact same thing for them. And every time I get an email like that, it brings a huge smile to my face because I know I'm taking a step in the right direction, and those steps are helping other people.
How did you deal with the risk as a SEAL and dealing with the worry of a risky decision?
I think if you're going to talk about risk, you have to start with the point or realization that you're never going to be able to reduce or remove completely risk. If you're able to do that, in my opinion at least, whatever it is that you're getting ready to do, it's not that important. Because important things are challenging and difficult, and things that are challenging and are difficult are going to have risk associated with them. Now, as far as dealing with risk as a SEAL, military-wide, or I can't talk about how the other services describe this because I actually have no idea. When I was in the Navy, they have a program called ORM, which stands for Operational Risk Management. I don't know if that's the current term of the day, but it is a program that is designed to objectively look at, first to analyze and assess the risk, then apply mitigating factors to that risk, and then you look at the residual risk associated with whatever it is that you may do. It could be a training evolution like a skydive or a shooting range, and it could be a combat operation overseas. ORM is part of every single evolution that we do inside of the SEAL teams. Some of them are just a template that we work off of because it could be an evolution that you repeat over and over and over again. But overseas, you look at every single phase of the operation and you spend an inordinate amount of time, or actually the better term would be a requisite amount of time, observing and analyzing those risks. And before you actually can get mission approval, it says on your mission deck that you submit for approval, it has a risk rating on there. And depending on if it's low, medium, high, you have to get certain approval up the chain of command before they're going to allow you to execute an operation. My point in saying all of that is that we're very aware of the risk and we do everything we possibly can to mitigate that risk. Sometimes we did that through additional training. Hey, we want to do a free fall insertion into a dive, which is pretty fun to do. You don't do it that often, and maybe the risk you will identify by looking at that and what you want to do and realizing you don't do it that often is that some additional training might be necessary to lower that risk. Maybe it could be an issue of education. Maybe we're getting ready to deploy to a country where we don't understand necessarily the cultural differences between that country and our own. So we could bring in a specialist and give us more education, therefore more understanding, and therefore reducing the risk when interacting with the local populace. Is there a piece of gear you could bring in that could do the job better, that's more efficient or effective at completing the task? Is there a time of day? Combat operation needs to happen right now, but if we could just wait 6 hours and go at night, would that reduce the amount of risk that we have? We're constantly looking at those areas, every single area that we can. And sometimes we say no. In training, you don't really get the opportunity to say no. So what you do is you continue to imply mitigating factors or safety mechanisms to lower the overall gradual risk, or you could break the evolution up into smaller pieces. But in combat, you might not have the ability to do that because you could be time limited and you need to launch on an objective and the risk is just too high. And when that happens, when the risk doesn't justify the reward, we say no and we walk away. Probably the only thing that would compel you to really take an inordinately high risk would be a hostage rescue. And that happens very infrequently, but that's probably the best example that I could give where you would be willing to accept an abnormally high level of risk because of the reward of bringing home a U.S. service member, or for that matter, a NATO or allied service member. Anything other than that, it's going to reach a threshold where the answer is going to be no, and you'll wait till the next night or the next weather pattern that makes it possible or more feasible, and you continue on. It's something that we always look at, and it becomes part of the culture, and you realize as the individual going through the training, yes, you realize that some of the things you can do just training to do your job can kill you, but you constantly have safety reinforced. So it's not something that you're sitting there worrying about. You're focusing on the evolution that you're trying to accomplish as opposed to the risk that could be associated with that evolution. Now, the second portion of that question, the worry associated with risky decisions. There's a couple things just in that sentence that I want to address. The first one is I never made risky decisions. I made decisions in high risk, high consequence environments, but they were based on the following: objectively observing the battlefield, assessing all of my available options, then I would make a decision. I would observe the impact of that decision, and I was constantly prepared to change the plan. The key to being able to do that is to stay ahead of decisions. You cannot become overwhelmed by them. And I would describe this as the difference between being a chess player or a checkers player. If you're only thinking about the move that's one footstep away, or your next footfall coming in front of you, you're constantly behind the power curve. I was always trying to think 3 to 5 steps ahead, because the worst thing that you can do is get caught in a situation where all of your hard drive space available is completely taken up trying to make a decision, and then something else happens, and then something else happens, and it builds upon itself, and the next thing you know, you're overwhelmed and you're combat ineffective. One of the best things you can do to help clear up your decision-making process is to make as many of the decisions as possible in an environment that's air-conditioned or casual or whatever makes you feel comfortable. Make critical decisions before they are critical, and as many of them as you possibly can. So there's 5 phases to military operation, and some terms that you would hear often inside of those phases and briefs would be QRF, which stands for Quick Reaction Force, basically calling for help, and it stops just about everything in your geographical area, if not the battle space, and all of the assets are redirected towards you because you're saying, literally screaming at the top of your lungs, not literally, but figuratively, help me. You hear about medical, you hear about comms. All of those things, they show up in every phase of the operation. And decisions based around how many people we can sustain being injured. What happens if somebody is killed? What if we lose some critical skill sets along the way? Each of those 3 things has a threshold, and if you reach it, that number is determined before you actually go anywhere. Once you reach that threshold, you call the QRF because you thought yourself through it before it became a crisis. Same thing with the medical, same thing with the comms. Think about that critical stuff before it comes critical so you can save that horsepower between your ears in the moment to make the decisions that are being thrown at you because the chessboard is changing in front of you. Now, the last part of that is the worry of the risky decision. which, like I said, we didn't make risky decisions. We made decisions in high-risk environments. Worrying about risk does not change the outcome. Neither does excitement. The point being that any emotional, pick the word that you want to, excited, worried, concerned, none of that matters. None of that changes the outcome. All it does is it takes up brain power and energy focusing on that emotion, where you would be much better served objectively executing your OODA loop, which is something that I have talked about in previous podcasts. It stands for observe, orient, decide, and act. Maybe in the future I'll go over it again, but go to Wikipedia and look it up. It's a description and definition of a thought process that can help you keep from getting stuck. Don't be worried about your decisions. Be prepared to act if your decision creates an environment or a situation that requires different or more action. So don't worry about it. Think about everything that you can before you make that decision. Make the decision and then stand ready to make another one. When is it appropriate to let a fellow employee know it is time to get their act together on the job, especially if you get along with that employee? And to that, I would say there are two things. The first being, the longer you wait to mention something to that employee, the more ingrained the behavior is going to be. If it's something that they get away with for a week and nobody says anything, there's really no reason to expect their behavior to change in the subsequent weeks. So the earlier, the better. And the second part of that is, look at this from the perspective of you're the person who's messing up. How quickly would you want to be told? And like you said in the question, especially if you get along with that employee. So I'll just change that to saying you're friends with the employee. If I'm messing up, I would want my friends to tell me immediately. And as a good friend, if I saw my friends messing up, I would tell them immediately, as soon as possible, so they would have as much time as possible to correct that behavior or deficiency. Why wait at all? Be humane about it. I mean, tact is going to be important. If you just roll up to somebody and say, hey man, you suck, you need to stop doing that, you maybe should expect an other than stellar reaction. But if you pull somebody aside and just like, hey man, this is kind of what I'm seeing. This is what I'm seeing is the outcome of that action or behavior. I've heard somebody talking about this, or, just the bottom line is, if you're friends, act like it. Hook a brother up or hook a sister up. Waiting is not to anybody's benefit. This next question gets asked, I think, almost every time that I reach out on social media for podcast questions. And I'm not sure why anybody cares how I train, but the question is, what does my training look like these days? It looks the same as it did 15 years ago. And by that, I mean, I use the same movements and I have the same philosophy when it comes to exercise. Really, the only difference is the end state that I'm applying it towards. I basically have 2 seasons now that we have moved to Montana. I have the snow season, which is going to be snowboarding both at the resort we can see from our house and in the backcountry, because there is ample opportunity, probably more opportunity in backcountry, quite frankly. So that's my snow season. And then I have my no snow season, which is going to be jumping/hunting, even though what I've determined in my robust and extensive 6-month career bow hunting is that the season doesn't really end. If you know the right people, you're going to find yourself traveling all over the place. The season for Montana starts in September, and for bow, it ends, don't quote me on that, it's somewhere in November. I actually think it's right before Thanksgiving. But if I didn't have the ability to travel, and I didn't know amazing people like Dudley who present to me opportunities to continue to go after different animals in different environments, I'd have like 2.5 months, and those would really be my seasons. The beauty of my snow and non-snow seasons is that the training for one complements the training or the activity in the other one. The way I would train for hunting is exactly the way I would train for being in the backcountry. So I can keep my training with the movements, with the philosophy. And really all I change is I will modulate my intensity. For years, I worked for CrossFit, and I was constantly around people who could just kick my teeth into the dirt when it came to exercise. And the combination, I think, of that and just getting older, I've lost the fire that I had when I was in my 20s of just smashing myself every single workout. For one, I don't recover as quickly. But two, I'm kind of considering longevity more than deadlift at this point. I want to have a strong enough deadlift right now, or every exercise, fill in the exercise. I want to be strong enough that I'm competent at what I'm doing and have one eye on that goal and then the other eye on how long can I do this to extend my life and be functional for as long as humanly possible. So the philosophy that I follow is still the same one that I found in the CrossFit program, or you can call it a functional training if you don't like the word CrossFit, or you could just kind of call it common sense, in my opinion at least. I like to train the movements that I'm going to encounter, not in a gym, but outside of the gym, because I try to spend as little time as possible in a gym. Outside of the gym, you find multi-joint movements. It's always going to be two joints. It's going to be your wrist, your elbow, and your shoulder. It's going to be your ankle, your knee, or your hip. Really, the only places on earth you're going to find environments where you lock those other joints. Why do I keep saying joists? Where you lock those other joints in place and focus on a single joint movement is actually the gym. Bicep curls. Preacher curls is a perfect example. You're trying to take the shoulder out of it. You're sitting there and you're just hinging at the elbow. I would rather have somebody do that than do nothing. And I'm actually and absolutely not trying to talk smack against people who choose to go down that route. I'm just saying for myself, it hasn't been as effective for me outside of the gym, so I avoid that. I try to train at a high heart rate, and I try to train my legs as often as possible because I'm a biped and spend every single day on my legs. So I don't think you should just do legs one day per week. You should train them as often as you possibly can. And in addition, I also spend a lot of time thinking about rest and recovery and nutrition. You're kind of wasting your time otherwise. If you are training without an end state and you don't give yourself enough rest / recovery and you eat like a garbage disposal, I'd say probably at best you're treading water. You might get some good results, but it's nothing in comparison to what you could get if you put equal amount of focus on that rest and recovery and nutrition. So that's how I train these days. That's not necessarily how you should train. You got to find a system that works for you, and more importantly, a system that works for your end state.
Mullet or no mullet?
This one's pretty straightforward. I'm a serious guy, but I like to party. And there's really only one haircut that services both. So, mullet.
What's been your biggest blessing in disguise so far in life?
This question got me thinking a bit too. And what I keep coming back to when I think about this is the night that I got shot. And that was February 5th, 2005. But before we talk about the blessing in disguise, might as well fill you in on where I was at the time. And where I was at the time was on an awesome roll. I was 27 years old, at the military command I wanted to be at, operating at a level that I had never really dreamed of or thought possible, with my nose and head completely down into the grindstone, pushing as hard into it as I possibly could. I was 10 years into the military, and I had put 0.0% of my time and effort into thought about the after. And then an AK-47 round, literally and figuratively, put me flat on my back. And in that moment, and for the I'll call it 9 to 12 months after that moment, it was anything other than a blessing. I was utterly miserable for that time period, and I have no doubt that I was miserable to be around. It was a hard stop for everything that I had going on, and it forced me to think about what would happen if that phase of my life was over, because that was the reality that I was thrown into. One day, like I said, I was on a roll. The next day, I was being rolled to a helicopter to be flown out of the country. Hard stop. It really forced me to think about the future. And when I look back, it actually forced me to take my family and leave Virginia Beach and return to San Diego. And the duty station that I went to was this Naval Special Warfare Center, which is the command in charge of, or was again, when I was in, was the command in charge of overseeing SEAL training, known as BUDS. And I became a BUDS instructor, which ended up being one of the most rewarding tours that I had. I received my commission while I was on that tour, and it also allowed me time to start working on things or just lift my head up a little bit to see what kind of opportunities were out there. And the opportunity that presented itself to me while I was there was the ability to start working for CrossFit. Now, the ability of working for CrossFit and in the execution of my job was my first exposure to public speaking, other than briefing students in training, which is easy because they're required to pay attention and pretend like you are the best public speaker in the world. People who are paying $1,000 for a weekend, the exact opposite. They're not required to pay attention to you, and if you suck, they're going to tell you about it. So that was my first exposure to that. And it became the job that actually allowed me to seamlessly leave the military and join the civilian job market. So in essence, had that night not happened, my life would obviously be completely different. I'll tell you right now, I wouldn't be talking to you through this microphone. I absolutely would not have a podcast. Well, maybe I would. I don't know. It's hard to say what my life actually would have looked like. But I can tell you with certainty that I would not have become an officer. I was climbing the enlisted rank structure ladder. I would not have started working for CrossFit headquarters because I would have never had the time to do so. And I would have been geographically separated from where they were. And I actually may well have been on Extortion 17, which was my old troop from my old squadron, and quite a few people who were on that helicopter I knew pretty well. And I actually turned over departments to a couple of guys that were on that helicopter. So who knows how life would have played itself out. More often than not, people will rotate out of the squadrons and go to other ones, but there is a chance that I also could have been sitting on that helicopter, and that would have been the end right there. I still, to this day, rolling my ankle is probably the biggest issue that I have. So I still deal with some of the physical issues associated with that injury. The biggest difference is that I don't look at it as something negative in my life, even though there was a lot of negative things associated with it. In the aggregate, when I look back, that was really the point where I reached the T intersection. Well, maybe it was more of a Y. It wasn't a drastic T. They weren't 90-degree turns, but I was looking at maybe a 45-degree departure. Continue down one road or lift my head up a little bit and maybe we'll go a mile down the other road and see what other kind of opportunities present themselves. Would have never thought I would say getting shot was a blessing in disguise, but when I look back at my life, that's it. That's the single biggest one that I think I have. What broadheads were you using on Lanai when stalking around the basin? FYI, I spent 10 days hunting Lanai the same time you were there, just in a different area. Hit nothing! Exclamation point. I know exactly how you feel. Thanks for the info. This question was actually asked a few different ways. So I'll cover my arrow setup. And this is the arrow that when I went out to Dudley's house and he really started dialing me in on my setup, this is what he set my bow up for last year, which was the Carbon Defiant. I'm now shooting the Hoyt Redworks RX-1, but my arrow is the same. It is a 28-inch Easton 5mm full metal jacket, 100 grain field tip for practicing, and the broadhead that I shoot, I would say 90% of the time is a Rage Trypan, which is also 100 grain. On the arrow itself, I have knock-on wraps, and I shoot a 3-fletch AAE Max vein specifically. I've heard Dudley talk about the difference between 3 and 4 fletch, and I believe he even has like a 6 fletch arrow. I have zero experience shooting anything other than that 3 fletch though. I know there's pros and cons to the 4 and even the 6, but Dudley and knockonarchery.com and all the videos, he's going to be actually, and beyond that, listen to his podcast if you're an archer, right? It's Knock On Podcast. he talks about this type of stuff. He is the resource and reference for that. So I can give you an idea of what I'm shooting, but if you want the in-depth knowledge behind that, you got to go to the source or the burning bush, which is what I call Dud. He's the burning bush. So that's the arrow that I shot. Dude, I feel you on being on Lanai. For 4.5 days, we had almost no wind. If you listen to the last episode with Barklow, I think we spent at least the first third basically lamenting our failures and talking about kind of like this question, how awesome it is to hear somebody else describe their frustration. So I get it. But that's the arrow that I shoot. And as of right now, I'm actually going to get ready to fletch some more arrows tomorrow. I have no intention to change because I really like the performance that I'm getting from it. All right, let's talk about skydiving for a little bit. Trying to, as I looked at these questions on social media, I tried to grab from, I couldn't answer them all. So there'll be another Q&A episode here shortly. But I tried to grab from kind of every arena that people ask me. So this one's about skydiving. And the question reads, I'm curious to hear how you challenged the MFF, which stands for Military Freefall course, and your progression into base and wingsuiting. Not sure wingsuiting is a word, but I'm still going to send it. I think wingsuiting is a word. I'm not positive, but I use it. And I'll pair this with, I got asked another question about downsizing your canopy, which for people who don't know what that means, when you jump out of an airplane and you deploy your main parachute, you are suspended underneath that main canopy. And when you're first learning, the square footage size of your canopy is quite large. I would imagine, I don't remember specifically, but I would imagine for myself, given my height and weight, I learned on a high 200 square foot canopy, like 280, if not bigger, or a low 300 square foot canopy. The canopies in the military are 360 square foot, plus or minus 10 feet, most of the time. And the more you jump, the more comfortable you get, and you rapidly get to a point where you realize that you're driving a school bus and you want to be driving a Porsche. Downsizing is that journey from the school bus to the Porsche. And I'm already talking about, so we might as well continue. Like I said, when I first learned, I was probably low 300 square foot canopy to high 200s. 20 years later now, my main parachute is 84 square feet. The number that I hope people focus on, though, is not the size of my main that I learned on or the size of the main that I jump now. It's the length of time it took me to get between the two. The biggest piece of advice I have for people is you have to take your time. Before you downsize, you need to be a master of your current canopy. Now, I often will see people who think that they are a master of their current canopy, but in my opinion, at least, they're confusing two different things. They're confusing, can I land this canopy at my drop zone in perfect conditions with, can I land this canopy on a long spot or a short spot or in high winds or gusting winds or in a crowd or off DZ or downwind? Most drop zones are very, very linear. There is a runway. Usually there's multiple runways. There are visual reference points that you can use. I'm going to open my parachute here. I'm going to fly my parachute to this point and bleed off my altitude until I'm ready for my approach. I'll fly over the top of the runway, or I'll fly near the runway using that linear reference point as a guide. I'll make 90-degree turns as I'm preparing myself, and then they'll do whatever landing turn they want to do. That's all fine and dandy. And the ability to do that over and over and over again at a drop zone means you're really good at doing that as a drop zone. But I don't think that means you're a master of your canopy. You need to be able to do that regardless of where your parachute may open. The best piece of advice that I ever received from the guy who taught me more than anybody else about jumping was never jump a canopy that you don't feel comfortable landing downwind and off drop zone. And that has actually happened to me for a variety of reasons. A couple of the times because I'm an idiot. And a couple of times it's just the way that it worked out. Regardless, every one of those times I was completely fine in doing so. And I've done some pretty sketchy demo jumps in my day that had no linear reference marks for me to use. And I only was able to successfully complete that because I understood the flight characteristics of my canopy in every single phase of flight. So with that, my advice again is to master your canopy in those phases of flight. flare technique was actually specifically asked as one of the questions. And I might be losing people who don't skydive right now, but just stick with me because the next question is not on skydiving. As you're getting ready to land a parachute, just like you're getting ready to land an airplane, you bleed off speed, or as much speed as possible, flaring the canopy or flaring the wing. You're not necessarily changing the shape of the wing, you're changing the pitch of the wing. And it slows you down to a speed where, like even on my 84, when I execute a proper flare, maybe I'm jogging a little bit, but depending on the wind, I've had instances where I literally just stop in place and it's like stepping off of a 1-inch step. But it takes time and it takes practice. You have to understand in your flare and you're flying your canopy, there's a variety of different ways that you can steer your canopy. You can steer it with your toggles, which should be common sense to people who skydive, right? They're called steering toggles. You can steer it with your risers, your rear risers and your front risers. Both have the ability to steer your canopy, but input on the front risers is different than input on your rear risers. And you can also steer your canopy literally by contorting yourself in the harness, which is how I do probably 90% of my turns, to include the turn that I do before I land my canopy. I'm not pulling down on a toggle. I'm literally shifting my weight to load one side of my harness, which pulls on one side of my parachute, which initiates a turn. And then I center out my weight as I come out of the turn, so I have all of the energy stored in the wing. How do you learn to do that? 1, you take your time. And 2, you learn your canopy and you practice these skills well away from the ground, so there are no consequences to making an error. If I, on my 84, initiate a turn that's 300 feet too low, there's really nothing I can do at certain points other than impact the ground at a high rate of speed and at best hope for a wheelchair and a colostomy bag. At 5,000 feet in the air, well, the worst thing that's going to happen is I'm going to lose too much altitude or realize that I started my turn too late or too fast or too slow, and I can correct for it without that consequence. Master your canopy in all of its flight characteristics and all of its input, then downsize. And when you downsize, be reasonable about it. If you currently are jumping a 150, which is a pretty standard parachute size, and only thing I'm leaving off on that is square feet. So when I say a number like a canopy size, after that I should say square feet, but I just don't. So if you're jumping a 150, a reasonable jump would be perhaps a 135. An unreasonable jump for most people would be to go 150 to a 96 or 135 to 84. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm saying I would avoid it. I would not recommend it. And I would incrementally work my way down to these smaller numbers if that is something that you would want to do, whether for a smaller pack volume or increased performance. The bottom line is that if in the back of your head you have this feeling that you're in a rush to do that, understand that you are in a rush to one of two places. You're in a rush to the hospital or you're in a rush to the morgue. In addition to mastering your canopy and understanding the inputs, you have to take into account currency. You can get yourself to an incredibly high level, but then if life gets in the way and you take 6 months off, it is irresponsible and unreasonable for you to jump right back on that same canopy and do the things that you were doing to the level that you were doing them. So just keep that in your mind as well. Now, as far as how I challenged the military freefall course, honestly, it really wasn't anything that's high speed. The Army is the proponent of military freefall in the military. They have a 1-month course out in Yuma, Arizona. You go out there, you go to the wind tunnel, they teach you how to pack, you jump out of planes. I think you get, 20 to 30 jumps. I was at work one day and a message came across that said they were offering a challenge course to that curriculum. I forget the exact number of jumps you had to have. I think it was 150 at the time. Maybe it was 200. I went out to Yuma for basically 4 days, and all I did was I challenged the test gate curriculum. So jump slick, do your turns, jump with the ruck, jump at nighttime, all of the military gear, demonstrate your proficiency, and then that was it. Really nothing high speed, and I just happened to get lucky that I was already pursuing skydiving in my off time, and it allowed me to, save myself essentially 3 weeks of not having to go out to Yuma for that full-time period. The last part on jumping, the base jumping progression. Base jumping stands for building antenna, span, or earth. Think of it as jumping off an object or a cliff or a building, as opposed to jumping out of an airplane. You jump out of an airplane, you have 2 parachutes, a main and a reserve. When you base jump, you have 1 because you're closer to the ground and you really wouldn't have time to use your reserve. And I am going to go right back to what I said about skydiving. Take your time. Find a good teacher. The teacher that I can recommend the most, because I have the most experience with him, is a guy named Miles Dasher. He lives in Twin Falls, Idaho, which is the object that I learned to base jump off of. Most people in the U.S. learn on that object because it's legal 365 days a year. They have what they call FJCs, or first jump courses. If you have a mentor that can walk you through packing and object assessment and everything that you would need to know to become a competent and then hopefully a current base jumper, by all means do that. If you're interested in getting involved in the activity and you don't have that resource or reference, I suggest checking out Miles. Shoot him an email. I think he has a website, milesdasher.com. It's got everything you could possibly need on there. And then, so again, step 1 was take your time. Step 2 was find a good teacher or a mentor. And then step 3 is take your time. Be honest with yourself and your abilities and approach every jump with the mindset of, what can I do to not become a statistic today? Could I train more? Is there something that I could work on more that would make me more prepared for this? Could I do something that is lower risk? Could I jump an object that would allow for more response time on an off-heading opening? Could I jump in better weather? Could I just walk down and return another day because I'm mentally not in it? Bottom line, take your time and get into it for the right reasons. If you're going to get into base jumping because you think you're going to be a YouTube star, I'm not going to tell you not to do that. I'm going to tell you the odds of that happening and you surviving that journey, in my opinion at least, are very, very, very low. All right, this next question is about backcountry splitboarding, which is snowboarding in the backcountry, but instead of cross-country skiing from your trailhead to your summit where you're going to start your descent, from my understanding, traditionally, if you were going to snowboard, you had a couple options. One, you could put your snowboard on your backpack and you could snowshoe in while everybody else cross-country skied. I would imagine that absolutely sucked. Or you could I've heard of people who had basically collapsible cross-country skis, and so they would cross-country ski in, collapse the skis, put their board on, and board down the hill. And I have no idea when split boards were created. My first exposure to them was this year, but it's a board that splits in half and essentially becomes cross-country skis. You can tour all the way to the top of the mountain with skiers or other boarders. You put your board back together, and then you're snowboarding in the backcountry instead of being limited by skis. My exposure to this actually came from my brother-in-law over Christmas break in 2016. My first experience on a snowboard ever was miserable, and I think I talked about it in the last podcast with Barklow. I got turned around on ice almost immediately, cracked my head, and in that moment said, I'm never doing this again. This is the dumbest thing that I've ever done in my entire life. That was in, I don't even know, 97 maybe, 98 probably at the latest. Fast forward to 2016, and my brother-in-law and my sister and their kids were out, and we were skiing, and he kind of got us up to the resort and rented a snowboard, and for 30 minutes had to exercise in catching both front and rear edges, and anybody who boards knows exactly what I'm talking about. It's painful, and it's frustrating. But he picked it up pretty quick, and we also were riding some very mellow stuff. And later that evening, he put on a documentary created by a guy named Jeremy Jones, who I would say, I don't know enough about the splitboard world to say where he falls. I'll say he's a very accomplished snowboarder, and he's an extremely accomplished backcountry boarder. And instead of taking helicopters recently, what he started doing is just being dropped off in the backcountry via airplane, maybe even helicopter, I don't know, but they get all their stuff there, and then they they manually climb all of these mountains. They tour with their split boards as far as they can, and then the boards on their back and their crampon and their ice axe, but it's all human powered. And the movie he put on was called Higher. It's actually available on Netflix. I highly recommend you check it out. His name is Jeremy Jones. He has a trilogy, Deeper, Further, Higher, and it's all backcountry snowboarding. That was extremely intriguing to me when we were watching it. I didn't even know that split boards existed, but we were talking about already, thinking about moving up here, and it really planted a seed. So when we got up here, I had the opportunity, got linked in with some local people who have the gouge and the spit on the backcountry, and got linked in and had the opportunity to go do those things with them. So I needed some gear. I got exposed originally through the Jones video. So I got a Jones board. Somebody actually asked me specifically what board I ride in the backcountry. I have a Jones Solution split board. And I think I got a pretty good chance of actually getting Jeremy on the podcast here, probably during the summer months, because I think he's out just tearing it up right now. But he's also, he has a company called, or an organization called POW, Protect Our Winters. He is very passionate about climate change. So I want to talk to him about that, and then also obviously pick his brain about how to not break my face or the back of my head on my snowboard. But I digress. I kind of just basically looked at what the guy was wearing and got all of that stuff. So that's how I got into backcountry splitboarding. My experience level with it is microscopic. My desire is huge. I just haven't had the time, and the season is kind of coming to an end here in Montana, and I'm starting to focus more on hunting. But that's where it all started. It started from watching that video and then moving to a place where I had the opportunity to do it. All right, this question comes from a veteran. I did my paratrooper thing in the 82nd Airborne for 4 years with 2 tours, and I'd say minimum combat. I'm out now. I've always wanted to go to the Green Beret route, but made bad decisions and life contributed. I know how you feel, buddy. I now have the opportunity at 32 years old, but I'm probably going to pass in lieu of being around my new 8-month-old daughter as much as possible. I feel like I'm making a good decision, but I also feel like a bitch, and I'm sad about not being associated with a warrior society. What do you think? Well, I think you should be very proud of your service, and who cares about how much combat you saw? Be very cautious using that as the metric for the value of your service. And I try to reinforce this when I talk about my service as a SEAL, or when I talk about service in general. There was a generation of soldiers who served post-Vietnam, pre-9/11, who never had the opportunity to see any combat. And they were every inch the soldier and sailor and SEAL and Marine as the people who are serving right now. They actually probably put the majority of us who saw combat through training. And the lessons that they passed on to us are the same ones that we are trying to pass on to future generations. Combat is not what determines whether or not your service is valuable or not. It is the service in and of itself. So start with, just take that chip off your shoulder. Now, what does a warrior society have to do with wearing a Green Beret or a trident or a scroll or a patch? I would say, instead of feeling like, to use your words, a bitch and being sad about not being associated with the warrior society, create the society that you wanted to be around wherever you end up going. It starts with your mindset. I have 2 sons and a daughter. I think that there is almost no chance that they will ever wear a uniform, but they will be every inch of a warrior, if not more than I ever was. They're going to be leaders and not followers, but they're also going to understand that sometimes you have to follow to lead. I literally tell my kids every day that I drop them off, be a leader, not a follower. Stand up for what you believe in. I say that not to try to say something motivational to them right before they go start their day. I say it because it all starts with your mindset. Standing for what you believe in, standing up for people that can't stand up for themselves, being unafraid of doing the right thing, even when it's unpopular, That's a warrior society. And you don't have to wear a uniform to embody those things. In addition to mindset, another thing that may help you is surrounding yourself with like-minded people. One of the things that I really liked about the community of people that I came from and that I worked with is that their work ethic was high. They valued physical training. They valued camaraderie, and they valued teamwork. Well, you can find all of those things in organized sports. And I know this might sound stupid, but go join a club team. And in that club team, you're going to find people with the same mindset and the same mentality that you're searching for that would have come from being a Green Beret and surrounding yourself by those people. Go to the gym and find people who are there just getting after it and befriend those people. You really want to take it a step further, go to an MMA gym or a BJJ gym and start hitting the mats. And the people that you're going to find there are not, shying away from pain. They're pushing themselves. They value the hard work. They value the integrity. They respect the work. Those are the things that you're looking for from that society. So don't feel bad about what uniform you wear. Your uniform can be jeans and a t-shirt and flip-flops. Just create the society you think you're missing out on. And what I think will happen is people are going to be drawn to you, just like you were drawn to the Green Berets. This question also from Instagram. It reads, I've always carried a loaded gun in the car for protection, and I feel comfortable doing so. However, I now have a young daughter that is a year old and is starting to get into everything. It only gets worse. I'll stop right there and just say that. Stand by. What are your thoughts on the changes on how you carry while you have very young children that can't learn or don't understand gun safety yet? Do you add additional safeguards while the kids are toddlers? It's a good question. And if guns are a part of your life and family is part of your life, you're going to have to go through this phase. So we'll start with the children aspect first. If you're around children who are learning safety of any kind, you have to act accordingly. There's a reason we put protectors on the electrical outlets at our house. And I'm assuming most people do exactly the same thing. And as soon as they realize they're going to have a kid, they start looking around for things that could be potentially dangerous. Keeping the cabinet closed underneath your sink that has all the chemicals, right? You put baby safe locks on that stuff. Child aspirin bottles. Also, everything that a child could get into, because a child does not know what not to get into, you do everything you can as an adult and a parent to make sure that they're as safe as possible. So if you take extra measures for those things, obviously you need to take extra measures for guns. For toddlers and for toddlers and for children, and actually, you know what? Actually, yes, people who don't understand or are not capable of understanding the energy contained in those things, they have to be kept away. For toddlers specifically, your safest thing you can do is obviously a gun safe, or keep it on your person if you have a CCW and you carry on your person every single day. Now, I will say this, when your children are first born, they're going to do not much of anything. They're going to look at you. They're going to crap in their pants and pee and cry, and they're going to basically want mom, and they're not mobile and they're not able to climb anything. And you'd probably be safe putting a gun on a counter, somewhere that they can't reach when they're laying on their back or their belly. But the phase isn't going to last that long, and I wouldn't get into that habit, because as soon as they're able to climb stuff, the shelving theory, where I'm just going to put it where they can't reach, I would not rely on that at all. So again, your safest bet is going to be a gun safe. You mentioned specifically that you carry a gun in your vehicle. I would stop doing that immediately, because it only takes a moment, especially if the gun is in a compartment. I mean, even if it's even more so, if it's not in a compartment, if it's in I've seen the magnetized, it's not a holster. I don't know what, it's a magnet that you put the slide on, the top portion of the slide, and it just holds it in place. You have to keep it out of reach of a toddler or a child who's not going to know any better. It only takes a moment. So I would consider not carrying it in your car. Definitely when your daughter is there, But I would say maybe even in general, because if you forget and your daughter does come into the car and for whatever reason she's left alone, which it happens. I know people say that should never happen. Well, it happens in life occasionally. It only takes a moment. So think about your gun like the electrical socket. Do everything you possibly can, responsibly and possibly can, to keep it away from those who don't know any better. Now, as for the first part of your question, I have a question for you. You said that you've always carried a loaded gun in your car for protection and you feel comfortable doing so. My question would be, do you leave it in the car or do you put it on your person when you leave the car? Because if you leave it in the car, you're only carrying a gun for your protection in your car. Think about how much of your day is spent in your vehicle versus how much of your day is spent outside of the vehicle. And I want you to imagine a scenario that occurs outside of your car. A restaurant with your wife and daughter, Starbucks, you're at a movie or you're at a movie or you're sitting at work. How is that weapon in your vehicle protecting you at that point in time? And is it your plan that if something does happen that would require the use of that weapon, that you're going to run to your car, get it, and then run back? If that is your plan, I'm going to suggest right now that you reevaluate. If it's your only legal option and you can't get a CCW, but you can carry a loaded gun in your car, which I don't know. I don't know the laws. I'm not an expert on gun laws by any stretch. But for an example, in Montana, that scenario could actually occur. If you didn't have your CCW, you actually still can have a weapon in the car. So maybe, let's say for this instance, this question, you live in Montana. My recommendation would be to go get your CCW, go through the training, go through the educational requirement, apply for the CCW, and then carry the weapon on you as opposed to leaving it in your vehicle. If it's only possible to leave in your vehicle, just be realistic. Be very realistic about the impact you're actually going to be able to have on it. And if you only have it with you in the car, I have some more questions for you. One of them is, do you practice shooting seated? Because that is likely going to be the position where you're going to need to shoot from. Can you access the weapon, draw it easily, one-handed? Think about somebody trying to gain access to your car, pulling on your door. Well, you need to move with your other hand to get access to the weapon to do something with it. If it requires both hands and all of your attention to get that weapon, you need to reconsider. And the last thing I'll say is, just because you have a gun in the car doesn't necessarily mean you're any safer. They do not, in and of themselves, solve problems. Just food for thought. Last question for tonight. This one comes from Twitter. How do you reconcile the dichotomy of silent professional versus being a retired SEAL and trying to make a living? It's what you're known for. That SEAL title follows you around. Difficult or benefit? Community disapprove? ? Personally, I think it's all in how you approach it and your tact. There are incredible lessons to be passed on from the community that I came from, but the message that you deliver needs to be about those lessons and not about the person speaking. You have to be honest about yourself and your experiences in the community in general, and I think you have to be transparent. You have to let people know that you're speaking about your experiences and that you don't speak for the community as a whole. So I spent about half of my year doing public speaking. And yes, I'd be the first to admit that a large majority of the interest, maybe even all of it, comes from my background. But I have two guiding principles that I use. One of them is I never tell war stories, because if you want entertainment, go to the movies or hire somebody else. And two, I never talk about myself unless it's about a situation or a mistake that I made. And using those principles with the desire to be honest and transparent and take a professional tack to it, I have received zero negative feedback to date. And I would imagine it's the same for others who are conducting themselves in that manner. And that includes the podcast and the way that I try to talk about myself and the community and my experiences. I haven't yet to receive negative feedback. Maybe it's coming. Maybe they're talking smack behind my back. I don't know, but I haven't heard about it yet. Now, with this question, I'm going to dovetail into another one, which was my thoughts on the soft rep video, because this ties into an individual coming from my background and how he conducts himself. And if you haven't watched or don't know what I'm talking about, SoftRep is, I don't actually know what it stands for, but it's an organization, it's a media organization. And about a month ago, they posted a video from Niger, from the head cam of one of the 4 soldiers that was killed in the ambush. And on the head cam footage, you see the soldiers being killed, and you can very distinctly see one of the soldiers getting executed with a headshot, and it's disturbing to say the least. Now, my thoughts on it are twofold. One, I agree that it's protected by the First Amendment. The right to publish that using yourself as a journalist or a newsworthy source, I'm not going to argue that it's protected in its publication, but that doesn't mean that it's morally correct. And what irritates me the most about how it was posted under the guise that it shows the cost of what these wars actually take. And the reality is that it doesn't. What it shows is people being killed in direct combat, which is a role that is filled by roughly 20% of all service members. It's an incomplete picture at best, and it's clickbait at worst. To add to that, they watermarked SoftRep on there. And the 2 places that you could find this video were jihadist websites and SoftRep. Now, the individual behind SoftRep, he's made his own bed. His actions are defined by his lack of morals, honesty, and transparency, the things that I was talking about that I try to use as my guiding principles. And his reputation and his disdain from many in the community is, I believe, reflective of his actions. But what I will say to that is, and what I'll ask of you, and then I'll close up for today, is I need you to make up your own mind on that particular issue. However you may fall on the issue. If you support that organization, SoftRep, in any way, whether it be through following them on social media or subscriptions, my only ask is that you please unfollow me and don't support me in any way. We might have shared the same occupation, but we could not be more different individuals. So make your own mind up, and that's all I got on that. And that's actually all I got for tonight. So thank you, as always, for tuning in. Love the reviews. Again, love seeing the pictures of the gear out in the wild. I'm getting ready to redo the Be the Example t-shirt, so we'll have a new rendering of that coming up hopefully in the next couple weeks. Keep your eyes out for that. And that's about it. I'm going to be going on the road here shortly. Got a little bit of hunting action. Going to be linking back up with Barklow here in the next few episodes because we're going to be hunting together. And what I really like to do is, and I will do this, I'll reach out and let people know when it's coming. I want to do some scenario-based questions on his survival background. A lot of people reached out. They really liked that episode, and they had some specific questions, and I want to make sure that he can answer as many of those as possible. And that's it. See you next week. Later.